From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore. Pillars or columns have long been of interest to Freemasons. One has only to look around the lodge to see this. The master and the wardens each have a column or pillar near his pedestal. In addition, each warden has a miniature column or pillar on his pedestal. Each of these pillars has a specific meaning and purpose, as explained in our ritual. Furthermore, we frequently refer to pillars in our ritual. If one counts them, one finds 10 pillars mentioned in addition to the Master's and Warden's pillars. There are the 3 great pillars supporting a Freemason's lodge: wisdom, strength, and beauty, as described in the tracing board in the first degree. Then there are the 5 noble orders of architecture: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite, mentioned in the lecture on the tracing board in the second degree. It may be mentioned that an order of architecture is a specific type of pillar or column, distinguished by the ratio of diameter to length, type of fluting or absence of fluting on the column itself, ornamentation or lack of ornamentation on the capital, and so on. It must be emphasized that an order of architecture is totally different to a style of architecture, which refers to the manner in which a particular structure is built, for example, Gothic, French Renaissance Colonial, etc. Finally, there are the 2 great pillars which stood at the porchway or entrance to King Solomon's temple, and it is upon these that I propose to speak tonight. Authorities differ by as much as 50 years on the date of the erection of King Solomon's temple and the pillars. At first glance, it would appear easy to find some event described in the Bible which could be precisely dated, and, from that date, work back to the building of King Solomon's temple. We find any amount of statements such as, "In the 20th year of Jeroboam king of Israel, Asa began to reign over Judah and reigned in Jerusalem 41 years. But when we start to tabulate these events, we find omissions and overlappings that confuse the whole matter. It is almost impossible to work solely from the Bible and find the date of the erection of King Solomon's temple. Archaeologists, however, have found other records that enable us to date biblical events fairly accurately. For example, it was the custom of the Assyrians to appoint an officer each year to keep certain records. The year was named after this officer. A particularly complete set of these eponymous records, covering the years 911 to 659 BC, has been discovered. There is recorded in them an eclipse of the sun, which astronomers have calculated occurred on the 15th of June, 763 BC. From this fixed reference point, all events recorded can be accurately dated. These records occasionally refer to events also recorded in the Bible, thus dating the biblical records accurately. Again, other records have been found which refer to events recorded by both the Assyrians and the Bible, thus providing additional reference points for biblical happenings. By these means, we can be reasonably sure that King Solomon's temple was completed in 952 BC. When we try to ascertain the actual size of the 2 great pillars, we find confusion and difficulties. There are 2 stories of the building of King Solomon's temple, one in 1 Kings chapter 7, the other in 2 Chronicles chapter 3. The story in Kings states that the pillars were 18 cubits high, whereas the story in Chronicles states that they were 35 cubits high. If we look further, we find 2 accounts of the destruction of the temple, one in 2 Kings 25 and the other in Jeremiah 52. The stories are almost identical. They tell how the temple was destroyed and was smashed to pieces by the Chaldeans under Nebuchadnezzar, captain of the bodyguard of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Both accounts state that the pillars were 18 cubits high. It is interesting to note that the account in 1 Kings 7 of the building and in Jeremiah 52 of the destruction Both state that the pillars were hollow, and that the outer shell was 4 fingers thick, not a hand's breadth, as stated in our ritual. So now we have 4 accounts of the pillars, of which 3 state the pillars were 18 cubits high, the 4th stating that they were 35 cubits high. The odds certainly favour 18 cubits, but by other considerations we can show that the figure of 35 cubits is almost certainly wrong. It may be mentioned in passing that this difference of 17 cubits in the height of the pillars in the various accounts has caused a lot of worry and a lot of fancy figuring by people who should know better, in an endeavour to show that no discrepancy exists. For example, the Reverend W. Shaw Caldecott, M.R.A.S., wrote a book entitled Solomon's Temple, Its History and Structure, in which he, among other things, suggested that several words in 2 Kings 25:17 should be transposed, so that it reads, "It was upon a chapiter of brass," instead of "a chapiter of brass was on it," in an effort to prove that both accounts are correct. There is a much simpler explanation, and one I think is much more probable. It is simply this. The height of 35 cubits given in 2 Chronicles 3 is wrong. The writer of 2 Chronicles made a mistake. There are good reasons for thinking that this is the case. There are 3 ways of looking at the Bible, or of looking at the various books of the Bible. First, as the holy writings of the Christian faith, or, in the case of the Old Testament, of the Jewish faith. Second, as a piece of literature which has been copied and recopied, translated and retranslated, and in which various mistakes, errors, and omissions have occurred as a result. Using this viewpoint, scholars try by comparing various copies and other means to correct errors, detect omissions, and so on, and so obtain a version corresponding very closely with the original writings. You may recall the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls some years ago, and the impact they had on scholars engaged in study of the Bible. The third viewpoint is to regard the Bible, or parts thereof, as an historical record of a particular people living in a particular place or country. Using this viewpoint, the findings of archaeologists working in the same or nearby areas can be used to confirm or deny the happenings recorded in the Bible, or to show that the events recorded took place at the time stated or at a different time, as the case may be. For example, the Assyrian record I mentioned earlier is very useful, as are many other records which have been. Another method used is to compare critically biblical history as recorded in the various books. For example, one could compare the historical record of Samuel and Kings with that of Chronicles, which covers roughly the same period. Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer who lived in Germany between 1483 and 1546, believed that Chronicles is untrustworthy as an historical record. Later, another German, De Wet, was able to show conclusively in 1806 that Chronicles is untrustworthy as an historical record. Chronicles is, of course, still very much part of the holy writings of both the Jewish and the Christian faiths, in spite of its deficiencies as history. But because of its deficiencies as history, we may reasonably assume that the height of the pillars given in Chronicles, that is, 35 cubits, is another error, and that the pillars were in fact 18 cubits high. Which brings us to the next question. How long is a cubit? First of all, a cubit is not a specific length, as, say, a metre or an inch. A cubit is rather a class of measures or lengths related to the length of a forearm, from elbow to fingertip. The word cubit is a Middle English word, that is, it was first used between about 1100 AD and 1500 AD, and is taken from the Latin cibotium, all elbow. Any measure between about 17 inches and 22 inches could be called a cubit, and indeed, the term includes measures up to about 27 inches. The common idea that a cubit is 18 inches long seems to stem from the fact that there is, in India, a measure variously called a kovid, hath, or cubit, which is 18 inches long. From measuring rods found at the pyramid of Snefru, one of the pyramids of ancient Egypt, we know that during the Third Dynasty, about 2800 BC, a cubit of 20.62 to 20.66 inches was in use. This was known as the royal cubit and was used throughout Egyptian history. The Egyptians also used a short cubit of 17.72 inches. Again, measuring rods have been found. This short cubit is recognized as the early Jewish cubit, but at 17.6 inches. Another measure, first found in the 12th dynasty, 2000 BC, is a cubit of 26.5 to 26.7 inches. Accurately made measuring rods have been found. This measure of 26.5 to 26.7 inches has been found at various places and times in both full-length and half-length forms, that is, at 26.5 to 26.7 inches and at 13.3 inches. It appears in Asia Minor at 13.35 inches, in Greece at 13.36 inches, in Syria at 13.22 inches, and as the Stambuli cubit at 26.6 inches. However, from our point of view, the most interesting use of this measure is at Lachish, a town some 30 miles from Jerusalem. A measure of 13.18 inches was in use at about 900 BC, and was thus in use within about 50 years of the building of King Solomon's temple at a place geographically close to Jerusalem. Doubled, it is 26.36 inches. Now, we read in 1 Kings 7:23 that Hiram made a molten sea, 10 cubits across and 5 cubits high, which held 2,000 baths. The bath is a measure of capacity, stated to be equal to 2.38 litres. So now we know the capacity of the molten sea, which could have been, from the account given, either hemispherical or cylindrical. If it were hemispherical, it would imply a cubit of 26.2 inches, which is close to the Lachish cubit used some 50 years later. I am of the opinion, therefore, that the cubit used by Hiram was 26.2 inches long, or very close thereto. If we assume a cubit of 26.2 inches, the pillars stood about 39 feet high, and the chapiters about 11 feet high. This makes the pillars very impressive structures. A quick calculation shows that such a pillar without its chapiter, with walls 3.5 to 4 inches thick, would weigh about 75 tons. But there is no reason to suppose that the pillars were each a single massive casting. Indeed, there is good reason to believe that the pillars were made of segments of metal which, when fitted together, formed a circular hollow pillar. In the first place, common sense tells us that this is the logical way of doing it, for there are enormous difficulties in making a casting 39 feet long, weighing about 75 tons. Secondly, we have the two accounts of the destruction of the temple referred to earlier. Both these accounts state specifically that the pillars were broken into pieces. As you know, it is very difficult to break up metal some 3.5 to 4 inches thick with hand tools, which is all that was available in those days. But if the pillars were made of cast segments, breaking them up is something the soldiers of the day could have done easily. The Authorized Version of the Bible and our ritual both state that the pillars were made of brass, whereas the Revised Standard Version of the Bible states that they were of bronze, and this is almost certainly the metal used. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc, and the earliest known use of brass in any quantity is about 200 BC, some 750 years after the building of King Solomon's temple. However, there is evidence that bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was being made from the respective ores as early as 3500 BC. By about 2000 BC, bronze was being made from metallic copper and tin, which in turn had been made from their respective ores. There can be little doubt that bronze, which had been known and used from some 2,500 years at the time of the building of King Solomon's temple, was the material used to make the pillars. We are told that the casting of the pillars was done on the plain of Jordan, in the clay ground between Succoth and Zeredathah. Zeredahah, Zerethan, and Zathan are alternate names used in the various books and revisions of the Bible. Succoth is just east of the Jordan River and is about 35 miles from Jerusalem. Zeredatha is also about 35 miles from Jerusalem and about 4 miles west of the Jordan. They lie, or perhaps more correctly used to lie, roughly north-northeast of Jerusalem. I have not been able to find out why this area was used to cast the pillars and all the other bronze pieces, but it would appear that the fact that it was clay ground was important. One can envisage the workers building the foundry furnaces out of local brick, using the clay to make crucibles to carry the molten metal, making moulds out of the clay, and so on. Finally, we come to the actual position of the pillars. Which pillar was where? The authorized version of the Bible states that the right pillar was called Jachin and the left pillar was called Boaz. The Revised Standard Version of the Bible states that the pillar Jachin was on the south and the pillar Boaz was on the north. There can be little doubt that the porchway or entrance of King Solomon's temple faced east. So, to anyone standing in the porchway looking out, the pillar Jachin to the south would be on the right, and the pillar Boaz to the north would be on the left. As our tracing boards show the porchway from the inside looking out, the pillar Jachin is on the right-hand side of the tracing board, and the pillar Boaz is on the left-hand side of the tracing board. There are many other very interesting aspects of these two great pillars that one could speak on. Were they really named after an assistant high priest and the great-grandfather of David? Were they named by Hiram, as the Bible seems to imply? Or was the naming done by King Solomon, and the relevant Bible passage just an ambiguity? Were there globes on top of the pillars, or the tops more like giant soup bowls? These questions, and others, must be left to another occasion.